When is enough enough? Fighting over inheritance is a familiar problem. It happens all over the world, and it's an issue that occurs in every culture throughout the world. Oftentimes, many family members will contest wills, inheritances, etc., and sometimes this puts tremendous pressures on the family. In this passage, an unknown man in the crowd asks Jesus to get involved with a family dispute. The disagreement is between two brothers. We don't know the brothers' names, nor do we know the underlying issue that's causing the disagreement. What we do know is that the brothers that part of the crowd, the one brother that's part of the crowd, wants the Lord to intervene and take his side and rule that his brother gives him his inheritance. On the surface, what is wrong with the request? Well, let me point your attention to a couple of omitted details in the story. For example, the man did not give any background as to the cause of their dispute. Why is the brother withholding his share? What are the reasons? What is the amount in question? So why don't we put on our Sherlock Holmes hat for a second and then just use a little bit of deductive reasoning and just try to gather some more facts about this case. Okay, so what we can glean from this, we know that from Jewish history in the early first century, that rabbis are often called upon to settle disputes. We know that. We can deduce that. So rabbis sometimes will make these legal decisions. Another thing that we can safely say, I believe, is that the man, whomever he was, recognized Jesus as a respected rabbi who had the qualities and the qualifications to sort of sway people to his side of the disagreement. So having said that, he must have considered that Jesus had the required clout and could persuade his brother to give him his share of their inheritance. And also, by calling Jesus a teacher, he is admitting that Jesus has the moral authority to deliver a just agreement. Also, if we think about it, and the text doesn't say this, but the brother that's actually reaching out to Jesus must be the younger brother. How do we know that from the text? Well, because according to the law that's found in the book of Deuteronomy and other books of the Old Testament, the firstborn son received a double portion of his father's inheritance. That was strictly from the law. And the eldest son is also held accountable for keeping the family estate intact and for dividing it among his brothers, or siblings, I should say. Therefore, younger brothers often begin the process of asking for their inheritance. And we sort of notice this pattern in a couple places in Scripture. For instance, if we read a little bit further in the book of Luke, there's a parable about the prodigal son. And similar to this son, the prodigal son, or the younger son, asked his father for his share of the inheritance. And his father gave him 1/3 of his estate. Now, according to the tradition and the law, the oldest son in that parable would receive a double portion, or 2/3, whenever it was time for him to get his inheritance. So, knowing these things about the law and about Jewish tradition, we can safely assume that this is the younger son. But why is this disagreement going on? That's the thing we don't know. Perhaps the oldest brother wants to keep the land together, and maybe, just maybe, the younger brother simply wants his share. And so, to reach a resolution, the younger brother asks Jesus to intervene, or to assume the role of a mediator in order to settle their dispute. But Jesus refused. Why? Why did Jesus refuse to take the role of divider of inheritances? Instead, he immediately begins talking about greed. And as Jesus often does in Scripture, he clarifies his idea with an illustration or a parable. So in other words, he basically ignores the topic about inheritances and launches another discussion about greed. And there we have the discussion about the parable of the rich fool. And he focused entirely on greed throughout this parable. So you may be asking, why does Jesus sort of shift gears and talk about greed? Was it wrong for the younger brother to ask about his inheritance? And how does this parable even relate to what the man is requesting? Those answers I don't know. But all I know is that Jesus refused to judge between the brothers or take sides in their arguments. Perhaps it is because he knew the younger brother's motives and that he knew that his motives are not entirely pure. Maybe. Or maybe he detects some evil intentions embedded in his request. Could it be that Jesus recognizes that the younger brother covets his older brother's status in the family? Now, I can't say this with certainty that this was the case, nor do I really want to insert my opinion on the text. So I'll leave it to all of you to sort of resolve what's going on within the text. However, if I continue along this line of thought, Jesus does seemingly implies that the man's claim of inheritance is unjust and that his claim is illegitimate. And I say this for several reasons. Specifically, why would this unknown man ask Jesus to intervene in an inheritance disagreement? Because the Jewish law of inheritance are well documented in Scripture. They're not really hidden. Any rabbi worth their salt could have ruled on this complaint. There's scriptural precedents, like those found in Numbers, beginning in chapter 27, or Numbers in chapter 36. It's there, it's spelled out. These scriptures, including Deuteronomy 21, beginning in verse 16, these scriptures should have taken care of any questions about family inheritance. Maybe the brothers are extremely wealthy, and the younger brother is seeking to establish his status within the family as well as the community. We don't know. And again, any such argument on my part will be truly just speculations. But anyway, this story reminds me of a story I heard about a mafia godfather. So the mafia godfather finds out that his bookkeeper has stolen $10 million from him. The bookkeeper is deaf. The reason the bookkeeper was hired was because the godfather figured that the bookkeeper wouldn't be able to testify against him because he's deaf and he wouldn't hear anything that was criminal. So in any event, the godfather took his attorney, who happened to be able to sign with him, to meet the bookkeeper. And the godfather asked the bookkeeper, "Where's my money? Where's the $10 million that you embezzled from me?" The lawyer, using sign language, asked a question to the bookkeeper. The bookkeeper replied in sign language, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know." Then the attorney tells the godfather, he says that he doesn't know what you're talking about. The godfather takes a 9mm, puts it to the bookkeeper's temple, and he tells the attorney, "Ask him again." So the attorney signs to the bookkeeper, and he says, "Hey, you need to answer him or else he'll kill you for sure." The bookkeeper signs back, "Okay, you got me. I'll tell you where the money is." He says, "It's hidden, the money is hidden in a brown briefcase behind the shed in my cousin Enzo's backyard in Queens." So the godfather looks at the attorney and says, "Well, what did he say?" The attorney goes, he says, "You don't have the guts to pull the trigger." Okay. Now, I admit that is an extreme case of greed, But if I was to go a little further, I would suggest to you that greed is the moral opposite of generosity. It makes us worry about the future instead of trusting in the God of the future. Greed destroys us, but generosity blesses us. I believe that this scripture invites us to consider what we do with our possessions and to consider if our possessions give us a false sense of security for the future. Or do we view all of our possessions as part of God's good gift to us? And therefore, we consider our roles as Christian stewards of these gifts. And hopefully, they remind us that God requires us to share our gifts with those in need. I will also say that Scripture also invites our leaders to be faithful stewards in managing our national wealth and serving the underprivileged, not themselves or their allies. This scripture reminds me of Proverbs chapter 11, verses 24 and 25, where it says that some give freely, yet grow all the richer. Others withhold what is due and only suffer want. A generous person will be enriched, and one who gives water will get water. Brothers and sisters, I believe that when we give in to the impulse to keep everything we have, just in case we may need it at a later date, we're setting ourselves up to hear the words that we don't ever want to hear from God. The man in the parable was already very rich. And he was not being called a fool for being a wealthy person and having material success. He was called a fool because he never learned how much was enough. He never reached a point where he said, my needs have been taken care of, and now I will use my excess blessings to bless others. Instead, he hoarded, and for that mindset, he was condemned or called a fool. What do you think? How do you think Jesus' words would be received today in our culture? What if Jesus spoke to a room full of wealthy businessmen? How do you think our culture as a norm views this sort of teaching about wealth from Jesus? Perhaps they would say, oh yeah, sure, that sounds great in theory, but in reality, will it work? Or maybe it would be said it just doesn't work for us today. And then I would like to pose the question to all of us. How might we consider some simple ways to use our blessings to bless someone else and therefore move closer to the reign of God or experience more of the reign of God? What if you and I did an audit of our closets and dressers once a year, and if we didn't wear an article of clothing within that year, perhaps that article would be a good candidate to give away to someone else in need? Or what if we made a list of all the things that we need to live, and then have another list of all the things that we simply want for our lives? And then make a commitment to purchase only from the list of needs for the rest of the year, right? I was thinking, what could I do with the savings from that list? Right? Or what if for the next month, every time that we appreciate something that someone else has, that we take a moment and pause and pray for our own contentment with what God has blessed us with? And I only say these things not as a condemnation or to point the finger. I say this because I think that sometimes the admiration of other people in all its various forms, whatever that may be, can sometimes become a motivator for us to accumulate more stuff. And we're probably aware that our culture measures success a lot differently than we do as people of the kingdom. Our standards are a little bit different. For the non-believer, and I'll use the term casual Christian, I would suggest to you that oftentimes their self-worth is linked to the opinion of others and by the toys that we sometimes amass. But I would also suggest to you that if we constantly look to material possessions or to the opinions of others to make ourselves feel good or worthy, that we will be constantly chasing something that's unreachable, that we're not able to achieve. And I say this because these things fluctuate and they will vary from day to day. And if I can be brutally honest, the reality is that people are often unpredictable. And that's simply a reality. That is why I suggest that we look to the creator and sustainer of the universe for all of our self-worth. A God who loves and faithfully never changes, whose mercies are renewed each and every day. Blessings.